Cool. So to go on to the actual questions. So these are hopefully none of these sound like malicious. I'm genuinely curious.
Hmm.
How does like the the concept of nine-binary people to me is a little
Non-binary.
confusing. Yeah, non-binary. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Mostly because like obviously I believe in trans issues. I think they're really important.
Hmm.
But like as far as I'm aware, and again, this is just probably my misunderstanding. In order for, or not in order, but like the way trans issues work is essentially like, don't genders have to exist? And non-binary says that you don't belong to either category, or am I missing? Like, what am I missing?
So basically, like non-binary isn't not a gender. Like being non-binary is a gender, or usually it's an umbrella term for a lot of different genders. But usually, but like as shorthand, a lot of people will just identify as non-binary. So like, there's a couple things, right? Essentially, first you have to start thinking of you have to stop thinking of gender as like strictly binary, right?
No, I
Um,
don't think it's binary. For the record,
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
don't agree with
But
that.
I
Yeah.
mean, like that doesn't mean that other things which fall outside of the normal conceptualized binary are not genders, right? And so like
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
and so like for people who are trans, right? Transgender just meaning to be a gender contrary to what you were assigned at birth.
Yes.
Like if you were assigned male at birth and later on in life you are non-binary or you come out as non-binary, like that's trans because it is different from what you were assigned at birth, right? It is
Yes.
something
Makes sense.
else.
Yeah.
And so like for me, like no, that doesn't bother me. I think for a lot of trans people it does, but I mean like I don't know why. Maybe it's because like I think that there's a lot of trans people who are binary, like who identify as like male, female, man, woman, whatever,
Mhm.
um, who try really hard, or not really try really hard, who learn to rationalize their existence under a particular framework. And so even any challenge to that framework, even if it would not affect them personally, may come across as like an attempt to invalidate them, right? Like I think that's
Yeah,
usually like my understanding of a lot of it,
yeah, which I
right?
always like really worry about because like that's not my goal, right? Like I'm not trying to say that like
Yeah, no, I got you.
fuck you or whatever.
Hmm.
Okay, that makes more sense. So it's more of like a like if you don't feel like you belong to the particular category of like male or female, you can just say non-binary. It's like an all-encompassing like, hey, this is yeah,
Yeah, like just something that is not. I mean, literally, it's just not binary, right?
yeah.
And
Okay,
so like,
cool.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay, because then I was so confused because I was like, well, then how can that exist if like the entire like existence of trans people is like predicated on like not the binary but like the spectrum existing in the first place, right? Like that's the whole point is that like you think you're not something you were assigned at birth. So okay, but that makes a lot more sense.
mm.
Um,
So yeah, I mean,
okay,
like, let me set this down. All right, I'm done with my chicken.
cool.
So what's a way that I could be able to explain this? So
Wait, that made sense for the record.
the way that you described like
Yeah.
binary, like the spectrum being necessary. Um, so I mean, like,
I wouldn't say the spectrum is necessary. I would say like it exists as like we are as people for right
well, yeah,
now, but that's not it. Like,
but I mean, like in terms of the argument. So I mean, like,
oh,
um,
sure.
so just to be clear, right? You could have trans people under a binary classification of gender. It would just mean that there's only two classification. Like it would basically mean that there would only be two types of trans people: people who were assigned male at birth and who identify as female later on,
Mhm.
or people who were assigned female at birth and who later identify as male and are treated as male in society and all that good stuff. Obviously,
Mhm.
we know that this is not true
Yeah, of
because we
course.
have observed people. I mean, like the simplest way to address that is because we have observed people who do not fit into these categories. And so that's where a spectrum comes from, right? The fact that, like, whereas before we may have assumed from a lack of observation or a lack of understanding that there were only two kinds of categories, now we're at a point where we know that there are more who exist. And so we can see that if it's not binary, then it must be something else. And spectrum is
Ah,
usually the easiest to kind of
yes,
understand,
cool.
because like gender being like technically if you wanted to just say, oh, actually gender is trinary, there's binary, there's male, female, and other.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, like, we don't want to say that either, because like a lot of non-binary people have very different expressions of their gender, and to try and equate
Yeah.
them, like to basically like take all of them and equate them into one category,
Yeah,
a
it's
lot of
not
people would argue is like reductive, right? And so they would say it's
very
better to
reductive.
use a spectrum where it's like, you have like a spectrum of a variety of gendered expression and identification. That's more descriptively accurate than just like having basically an other category, you know?
Yeah, of course. So I guess like here's like what my question would be like. I don't necessarily disagree with anything you've said, but like if someone came up to me and said like, oh, I understand what you're saying, Danny, but it feels like what you're telling me is just that like these are just some men that feel a little bit more feminine, or some women that feel a little bit more masculine. Like,
Mhm.
what would you say to that?
So that's where, generally speaking, you have a difference between gender expression. Um, I'm trying to think of like the particular language. Usually, people would like draw a distinction between gender expression and identity. I would say that there's like a slightly different lens to that. But for a shorthand, that would probably be the easiest explanation, right? Essentially, like there's a difference between the way that you express yourself in certain ways and like the actual gender that you have, right? Because like for example, um,
Oh,
you could be
okay.
like, let's say that for example we have a trans guy, all right, someone who was assigned
Sure.
female at birth,
Hmm.
but who figures out or realizes that they are a guy,
Hmm.
and so comes out and says, I am a guy, I am a man. All right. Do we
Sure.
then assume that that person cannot act feminine, right? And I would
Yeah. Of course.
say,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and I would say no, right? Now, as far as the literature, it gets like complicated because technically, like, there's a simple way to kind of address this. The way that I would address this is to essentially say that what the goal then should be in society is to try and like essentially change the average person's opinion to make it so that anyone could express anyway and it wouldn't affect how people gender them. Um, I don't think that's necessarily true nowadays because unfortunately, if you have like a trans guy who doesn't do a whole lot of medical transition and presents super feminine,
Yeah.
then like
Unfortunately, yeah.
there's a way, then like they will probably be gendered as a woman in society, or people won't know, and that's bad. And so we want to like make
Oh,
sure
of
that
course.
we're doing what we can to make sure that they are not misgendered, right?
Uh-huh.
But essentially, like the way that I would explain it, like as a shorthand, is to say that like you know, like maybe to your friends in like a short discussion, just
Uh-huh.
to affirm that like gender, like just because you're a guy does not mean that you cannot express femininely. Just because you are a woman doesn't mean that you cannot express masculinely. And just because you're non-binary doesn't mean that you have to express androgynously, right?
Ah.
Does that make
Okay.
sense?
That makes perfect sense. But then my next question, well, I guess like, oh no, that actually no, that makes sense.
Okay.
Um, it's still their concepts are a little confusing, but again, I mean, I don't imagine this topic was exactly the easiest one. I don't think they teach this in elementary school. Last time I checked.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
like it is a generally like it is a harder subject to deal with, right? But I mean, like that's
yeah,
probably like the super simplest way of expressing it. Just to acknowledge, like there's a difference between, essentially, if we want to look at like the difference between who you are, and then the way that you
you
express who
present.
you are.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
like those are
Yeah.
distinguishable ideas.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Cool. Awesome.